So this is particularly about IMF's framework for disaster resilience strategy and a few ideas about how to extend that to adaptation to climate change. Generally, when we say now adaptation and mitigation, climate change is implied, but in this staff note it's always attached, so they say adaptation to climate change or climate change adaptation. So sometimes I'll skip climate change and just say adaptation. In 2019, the Executive Board of the IMF approved the Disaster Resilience Strategy, a framework for building resilience to large natural disasters in vulnerable developing countries. The framework was developed to address the macroeconomic risks of natural disasters for small or poor countries and the associated challenges related to financing, policy implementation, and the coordination of development partners' support. I'll just read it because this is the main agenda for a while now of how to extend these on the three pillars. Okay, it follows a large body of work like the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction and World Bank work, now integrated and recapped in this paper from 2020, and is based on a three-pillar strategy involving ex-ante investment to limit the impact of natural disasters, financial resilience including fiscal buffers and pre-arranged financial instruments to protect fiscal sustainability and manage recovery costs, and contingency planning to address ex-post disaster needs. So nice three pillars. Subsequently, Grenada and Dominica adopted the framework to develop their national disaster resilience strategies. So implementations are always important because the reports can be produced and they can sit there unless they are tested on the ground. It's hard to know how to improve them, right? So this learning by doing and adaptive management is a key way to advance key strategies developed from these disaster resilience plans and so on, and especially how to extend that to adaptation. The climate change adaptation framework presented in this note extends the DRS approach to cover a broad set of issues. Climate change will alter the entire distribution of weather conditions, which is already happening, not will, it has already happened and is happening, including both averages and extreme conditions, and is likely to trigger changes that are not limited to weather events like changes in sea level, water reserves, biodiversity, migration patterns, etc. In fact, many of these adverse effects of climate change at the global level and for large countries may not be caused by disasters, as these only cause large damages infrequently and over limited areas, but by gradual changes that will have permanent effect, like shifted mean temperatures, rainfall amounts and patterns, biodiversity, vegetation, forest cover and corals, etc., fisheries, right? So we have to keep these in mind. Such changes include permanently hot temperatures, sea level rise. At the global level, disaster losses as a share of GDP have remained broadly stable over the last 2 decades at 0.2% of GDP. Even if climate change increases these disaster costs manifold, they would continue to represent a relatively small fraction of the range of costs estimated in the literature. This is key because before we said 31% of the deaths come from cardiovascular diseases and barely 0.5% are from natural disasters. You don't want to compare deaths just as statistics, but then you also compare GDPs. So GDP losses are at 0.2% as well, and they will remain small. So when you look at deaths from cardiovascular diseases and air pollution problem, for example, air pollution is not independent of climate change in the sense human activities bring about air pollution. But air pollution has more immediate impact and has been there for a while and remains every day of the year, unlike climate change, which are events, right? Monsoonal disasters or winter events and so on, cyclone seasons, hurricane seasons. So how do we manage disaster resilience strategy for climate change adaptation into these other goals of, let's say, reducing air pollution? Are air pollution going to be only co-benefits of climate adaptation? And with climate adaptation, what are we trying to do? Are we trying to save energy intensive lifestyles, or are we trying to save lives? If we want to save lives, should we focus on cardiovascular diseases and air pollution? So these are complicated issues. Weather disaster losses as a share of GDP for 1990 to 2017, you can see that they are relatively small all the way. So when these weather disasters make a lot of news, and deaths from them are very small compared to other diseases and so on, losses from them are actually a small fraction of GDP, then how do we justify this noise about climate change and the alarmist news? We have to be very careful about that. The focus provided in DRS framework remains, disaster resilience strategy framework remains appropriate for small and poor countries for which natural disasters are a macro critical source of risks. So big country like the US or European continent may see disasters as small micro scale source issues or risks, or source of risks, but for small countries and poor countries it can be a big issue. Addressing all effects of climate change for all countries requires a change in the coverage of pillars and needs that can be better reflected with a change in terminology itself. The DRS first pillar, ex-ante intervention to limit the impact of natural disasters through investments in resilient infrastructure, early warning systems, and improved building codes and zoning rules, becomes the prevention pillar to cover the necessity of addressing all risks stemming from climate change. Okay, so the DRS second pillar, financial resilience, including fiscal buffers and pre-arranged financial instruments to protect fiscal sustainability and manage recovery costs, becomes the macro fiscal resilience pillar and is broadened to encompass the added challenge of financing the solutions to all types of climate risks. The DRS third pillar, contingency planning to address ex-post disaster needs, becomes the alleviation pillar to address all residual climate risks, as these will not be limited to post-disaster risks. Okay, so that's the box here. Let's start with the discussion on alleviation pillar in this context, and then we'll stop when it becomes too long. The alleviation pillar, governments would benefit from planning how to alleviate the realization of adverse residual climate risks. You do all the adaptation measures using DRS extension or whatever else we have discussed before, and we'll look at some adaptation solutions later in this series of podcasts. After doing all that, you still have residual risks, and we have talked about how the private providers, let's say, of infrastructure assume the unacceptable risks, and government is left with acceptable risks. So there is residual risk that is distributed in ways. Disaster contingency plans are essential to ensure timely post-disaster support and reconstruction. This is part of the resilience. The resilience is tested best when a disaster happens and how the recovery happens, and disaster contingency plans are a big part of the disaster recovery and resilience overall, right? So financial inclusion is a prerequisite for the private sector to cope with residual climate risks. Access to safe liquid savings accounts, emergency borrowing, and insurance is crucial for households and firms to withstand climate shocks. We discussed this in the economic principles in the first SAF note as well. Thus, fiscal policy can also contribute to resilience by supporting and promoting financial access with non-distortive taxation and adequate incentives. Ideally, the financial system would help provide insurance and hedging insurers, right? Social safety nets can help to alleviate the adverse impacts from both extreme events and slow-moving transformations due to climate change. So chronic changes in the background of temperature, precipitation, humidity, and other things, rainfall patterns, I think I mentioned that already, and extreme events. So rainfall total may not change, but if rainfall keeps coming in heavy amounts, or it gets distributed to produce too many dry periods, then it's something that safety net has to address. When adaptation solutions are not affordable, compensation could be considered. So adaptation is integrated into the fiscal policy. It's provided for in terms of all the principles we have discussed. Residual risk is left, but the solutions may not be affordable as a whole. Some adaptation solutions may not be affordable. So then you are taking beatings, and then compensation has to be considered. For example, there might be areas investing in protective infrastructure. There might be areas where investing in protective infrastructure has a negative net present value. We talked about this. For example, it might be too expensive to protect a coastline from sea level rise when there are only few inhabitants. Under the same equity considerations, there can nevertheless be a case for compensating the affected inhabitants and supporting their relocation. All these support programs need to factor in and balance equity and efficiency considerations. So efficiency may still fit into cost-benefit analysis, risk-taking, inefficiencies, and so on, but equity becomes a normative question, and cultural values and other factors play into this as well. Okay, so let's come back and look at macro fiscal resilience pillar in the next podcast. So we are moving rather quickly. As I said, I always keep this brief, but provide you the reference so you can go back and look at the report, and of course the enormous number of nice references. I got cut off there. So the enormous number of references provided in each of these IMF staff reports or any of the papers I'm recording or the books, you should follow up if you're interested in deeper issues of these topics. I'm just providing courses as a starting point. They are not as detailed as they would be if I'm teaching it in a classroom. So just remember that, because I don't want somebody to take these and claim that I'm not being detailed enough. I posted something, articles I write in the media tend to be aimed at the general public, and they don't have many technical details, many times because you are given 800 words to make a point, and you have to be clear enough to the general public, the non-experts, but then somebody complained that it was too generic. Well, the points were made and it is non-technical. So this is similarly technical to some extent. All the courses are technical to the required extent, but they are brief because these are introductions, not the complete course with exams and tests to tell you how well you have learned and so on. So I hope that's clear. Okay.